Hi everyone, my name is Matt Cronfos. I'm a college student, and I like to talk about pop culture, history, and whatever I feel like talking about. Today's video is going to be about fraternities and secret societies. In late 2025, Indiana University suspended all fraternity social events and large gatherings due to numerous hazing allegations, banning events like tailgates, philanthropy events with alcohol, and parties, affecting all 27 chapters after initially suspending 4 fraternities to foster safe Greek life despite persistent risky behavior. I thought this was pretty insane because I thought it was pretty common knowledge that frats haze, even if they say they don't. From what I've heard from friends and family at IU, hazing is accepted in theory but banned in practice. However, this got me thinking. It is a fact that 76% of all U.S. Congress members and 85% of Fortune 500 CEOs are Greek alumni, despite a very small percentage of the U.S. general population being involved in Greek life. Considering how much distrust there is in government, corporations, and fraternities, I thought it would be really interesting to do a deep dive into the history of fraternities and secret societies in America, talking about their history, the way they've treated minorities and women, hazing, and advice for any people considering rushing or joining fraternities. So the original fraternity was Phi Beta Kappa, founded at the College of William and Mary in the year 1776 by a small group of students who wanted a private forum to discuss philosophy, politics, and moral questions, freedom to debate ideas that were seen as dangerous or unpopular, and an intellectual life outside the rigid college curriculum. The year 1776 mattered a lot because America wasn't even a country yet. And as a result, the freedom to speech and the freedom to gather didn't exist yet. As a result, the students had no institutional protection for freedom of expression and as a result met in secret. Members discussed Enlightenment philosophy, republicanism, criticism of the monarchy, individual liberty, and moral reasoning independent of church teachings. This was pretty wild considering that Britain was the monarch, and in the South, there were much more loyalists than there were patriots, which this meant that students could get expelled, faculty could get in trouble, and it could be interpreted as sedition. So secrecy allowed for intellectual freedom before the rights were even a thing. This makes Phi Beta Kappa one of the first free speech organizations in America, though it wasn't really that. Originally, Phi Beta Kappa was mostly a literary and philosophical society where a select group of students were chosen for their intellect and character and focused on self-improvement and civic preparation. It was more like an Enlightenment salon rather than a modern-day fraternity, but it spread fast. It spread to Yale, Harvard, and Dartmouth, but as it spread, its secrecy became harder to maintain. At this time, many early American colleges were suspicious of student-run organizations, especially secret ones. However, the general American public did respect secret societies. Before the 1820s, secret societies were seen to be respectable, enlightened, even patriotic. Fraternities reminded people of the Freemasons, like George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and Paul Revere. The hostility that would later emerge towards fraternities wasn't inevitable. It was triggered by a shock. And the shock would be none other than the death of William Morgan in 1826. Morgan was a stoneman, a bricklayer, a working-class man, not an elite, of inconsistent personal success living in Batavia, New York, a frontier town at the time. He was not a political radical nor a revolutionary leader, and was not anti-Mason by ideology. This matters because this crisis wasn't caused by some great hero trying to take down Masonry. It was caused by an ordinary citizen colliding with elite secrecy. So interestingly, William Morgan was a Freemason. He had been initiated into the Masonic lodges, although he had recently become estranged from local Masons. I want to make it clear, though, Masonry dominated the 1820s. They dominated local leadership, judges, sheriffs, businessmen, and was deeply embedded in civic power. This meant to challenge the Masons was to challenge the local establishment. So what did William Morgan decide to do? He decided to publish Masonic secrets in a book called Illustrations of Masonry. There are many reasons historians cite for motives as why he would do this. Financial, he needed money, personal grievances, he had resentment towards some Masons and maybe wanted to settle the score, or moral justification, maybe believing that the secret oaths that Mason took were improper. The important thing, though, was that doing an expose on Masonry was not illegal, and other exposés already existed. What made Morgan different was when he did it and where he did it. Once the other Masons learned of William Morgan's book, they reacted aggressively. Morgan was arrested for petty debts, jailed on minor charges, and though was released after public protest, this looked bad, but it got a lot worse. After being released from jail, Morgan was released by men who were widely believed to be Masons, driven west towards Fort Niagara, and last confirmed sighting being at the Masonic Lounge near the fort. Then, he vanished. No trial, no record of death, and no body found. Most historians believe that Morgan was abducted by the Masons, killed either intentionally through negligence, and his body was disposed of secretly, probably in the Niagara River. The key point in this is that the legal system never convincingly disproves Masonic responsibility. Morgan's disappearance triggered a mass outrage, because it appeared to show that a secret society could kidnap a citizen, members could shield each other from justice, courts, sheriffs, and juries might be compromised. This was terrifying to a young republic, especially one that had just lost thousands of lives in a bloody war about 40 years prior. Americans asked themselves, if Masons were loyal to secret oaths, do they still answer to the law? Several Masons were tried, convicted, and given light sentences. Though this only really worsened public anger, it seemed to confirm that Masons protected their own and justice looked selective. So the Morgan affair directly caused the anti-Masonic movement. This included mass resignation from Masonic lounges, church condemnations of Masonry, newspapers dedicated to anti-Masonry, and public burnings of Masonic texts. There was also the Anti-Masonic Party. Yes, a real political party, America's first third party, which nominated presidential candidates and argued that secret societies were incompatible with democracy. Their core belief was citizens cannot govern themselves if a secret power operates. This was a radical shift in American thinking. Universities became especially sensitive towards this because they trained future leaders, already looked elitist, and student secret societies looked a lot like Masonic lounges. College administrators feared public backlash, loss of funding, and legal investigations. And as a result, campus secrecy became a liability. Phi Beta Kappa was caught in the crossfire because they used Greek letters, had secret rituals, required oaths, and met privately, even though they were apolitical, nonviolent, and mostly intellectual. It just looked like a secret order. The real problems for Phi Beta Kappa would emerge at Harvard in 1831. In 1831 at Harvard, Phi Beta Kappa was still operating secretly despite faculty investigations, threat of expulsion, public criticism, and possible legal or disciplinary consequences. Under this pressure, Harvard undergraduates revealed the secret meaning of the Greek letters. Love of learning is the guide of life. The motto, the ritual, the symbols, the oaths, effectively destroying the secrecy of Phi Beta Kappa at Harvard. After this, Phi Beta Kappa abandoned secrecy. After 1831, they transformed from a secret fraternity into an academic honor society. Ritual secrecy became symbolic rather than real, and membership was faculty controlled. Selection was based on academic excellence, not social ties. Today, Phi Beta Kappa is the oldest honor society in the U.S., explicitly non-secret and focused on liberal arts and sciences. However, it split the fraternity world in two. Path 1, like Phi Beta Kappa, was the honor societies, with faculty oversight, academic focus, no secrecy, and was institutionally approved. The second path was the social fraternities, retained secrecy, student-controlled, and operated against faculty wishes. So before I talk about the rest of the history of Greek life in America, I want to talk about other secret societies throughout history and what happened to them. So the first society we're going to talk about is the Freemasons. I already kind of touched on them, but this will be in much more depth. Founded in the late 1500s to early 1600s, originated as a medieval guild of stonemasons who built European cathedrals and castles. Today they're still around as a social and philanthropic organization focused on personal self-improvement and community service. They originally were secret as they used symbolic rituals and passwords and met privately to avoid religious and political persecution. However, by the 18th century, Freemasonry had become socially respectable. Rituals were published, and today lodges are public-facing with websites for charity work. Is it still a secret? Not really. Some rituals and symbolic interpretations are still not really well known. Membership goals and structures are also kind of a secret, but generally, people know what happens with the Freemasons. They go from defensive secrecy to more symbolic privacy. My favorite secret society was the Illuminati, also known as the Bavarian Illuminati. The original order of the Illuminati was founded on May 1st, 1776 in Ingolstadt, Bavaria, modern-day Germany, by Adam Weishaupt, a professor in canon law. Their goals was to advance Enlightenment ideals, including reason, secularism, and universal equality, while opposing religious influence on public life and the abuse of state power. They were heavily influenced by the Jesuit hierarchy in Freemasonry, and the order used a 13-degree system of initiation. At its peak, they had between 2,000 and 3,000 members, including people like Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. However, they were incredibly suppressed. The Bavarian government under Elector Charles Theodore outlawed the society in 1785, making membership punishable by death, and by the late 1780s, the order had effectively ceased to exist. Interestingly, the Illuminati are often confused with Freemasonry because Adam Weishaupt joined a Masonic lounge in an effort to recruit influential members and adopt their organizational structures. While many Illuminati were also Freemasons, the two organizations remained separate. Weishaupt viewed Masonry as a tool for his own radical political goals, which often conflicted with the Masonry ban on political discussions. This overlap fueled rumors that the groups were one and the same, and that the Illuminati went underground within Masonic lounges, but this simply didn't happen. However, there are a lot of conspiracy theories associated with the Illuminati, despite the fact that they ceased to exist by 1785. Modern conspiracy theory groups allege that the group survived suppression and continues to influence global events, governments, and finances to establish a new world order. Symbols like the Eye of Providence, the eye atop of the pyramid, are frequently linked to the Illuminati, although they were originally Christian symbols and Masonic emblems with no verified ties to the original Illuminati group. Multiple online entities claim to be the official Illuminatis, but they are widely considered scams to attract paying members. While historians confirm the group's existence, there is absolutely no evidence that the group survived into the 21st century and continued to exist. However, I do think it is really interesting that they had ties to Freemasons who were in America, and I think due to the anti-Masonry movement of the 1830s, I think there's a lot of anxiety that continues to this day that there's a shadowy elite influencing U.S. politics, and I think the Illuminati has somewhat become an avatar of that. Okay, so for the rest of the video, I'll be talking about social fraternities up to the present. The first social fraternity was Kappa Alpha at Union College in 1925. It was different from Phi Beta Kappa because its main purpose was friendship and mutual loyalty, not grades, debate, or any formal academics. It was still selective and secret, but was more socially motivated. To give you some background, a college campus looked a lot different in 1825 than it does in 2026. Colleges were tiny, often less than 200 students. There were strict rules, curfews, mandatory church and alcohol bans. Faculty controlled nearly every aspect of life, and student social life was heavily suppressed. Kappa Alpha formed as a private refuge from institutional control, not as a party organization. Here's what they actually did. Early Kappa Alpha members met in quietly rented rooms or private homes, read literature and poetry, talked about politics and philosophically informally, and focused on conversation, companionship, and trust. Think more like intimate salon than party house. Rituals and secrecy were still present. Rituals mattered a lot as solemn, not abusive. Oaths emphasized honor, discretion, and loyalty, and symbols and passwords were taken very seriously. Kappa Alpha members were typically upper-class students who were socially confident, not necessarily wealthy, who were interested in long-term friendship, emphasizing equality among members, mutual obligation, and lifelong connection, which was a new idea at the time. Interesting thing was, hazing was minimal or non-existent. New members were treated as future equals, not subordinates. So throughout history, there are many events that will lead college-aged people to fraternities. A lot of them are wars. During the Civil War, colleges go silent. Considering most men were busy fighting in the Civil War, there was no one really keeping campuses alive, so they kind of shut down during the war. However, after the Civil War, veterans returned to colleges seeking structure and support that they had during the war. Soldiers bonded with another during the war, so it only made sense that the fraternities' promise of brotherhood would bring them back. This led to fraternities going national. Instead of it being a few private elite colleges, as they'd been for over a century, now there are fraternities with multiple chapters in multiple colleges. During Prohibition and the Roaring '20s, fraternities were the place to be. Since alcohol was now illegal and fraternities now had off-campus housing, people could easily enjoy alcohol there, which caused them to gain immense amounts of power and prestige. However, the biggest change was after World War II. The GI Bill of 1944, signed by President Roosevelt, helped transition veterans back to civil life, including promising educational funds. This resulted in millions of veterans heading back to school who were After World War II, universities stopped trying to suppress fraternities, began treating them as housing providers, social organizers, and alumni connection points. This was a major shift from early suspicion that defined the early fraternities. However, the biggest change was that the veterans reshaped the fraternity culture on the inside. World War II veterans brought militarized norms, thinking a strong hierarchy, respect for authority within the group, and an expectation of conformity. Hard drinking culture became a massive part of fraternities. Drinking was seen as a stress release and a bonding between fraternity members. Normalized heavy consumption became a thing. Discussing poetry and literature is no longer seen as masculine, and therefore fraternities stopped focusing on them. Fraternities now really focus on camaraderie and enjoyment. Additionally, the post-war prosperity of the 40s and 50s meant alumni donations increased dramatically. Large permanent houses were built, chapters doubled or tripled in size, and fraternities became the central social hub of colleges and the gatekeeper of campus popularity. Fraternities also became networking pipelines into business and political careers. Greek life was no longer optional, it was now dominant on campus. However, because of this macho masculine culture that began to dominate fraternities, hazing intensified and becomes routine. Basically, veterans had accepted hardship as normal, and initiation was framed as earning your place and testing your character. Practices were passed down uncritically, and hazing became more physical and endurance-based and less symbolic. I will be talking about hazing in much more detail a little later. However, the dark side of this was that exclusion and conformity were now big parts of fraternities, although I will argue that they always were. What happened was, because they were excluded, minorities would often start their own fraternities, which in turn became national. The Latino fraternity Phi Eta Alpha was founded in 1931. The first black fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha, was created in 1906. And the Chinese fraternity Rho Psi was established in 1916. For minorities who wish to join historically white fraternities, it has always been a battle. Until the 1910s, the Alpha Sigma Epsilon governing law stated that any male member of the Aryan race was eligible. And even after the word Aryan was removed from their creed, members would still need to be socially acceptable, essentially meaning no African Americans, no Jews, and no Latinos. In the 1947 Truman Commission, President Truman called for the doubling of college enrollment from 2.3 million in 1947 to a minimum of 4.6 million in 1960, emphasizing the importance of breaking down racial barriers in higher education. Southern fraternities, fearing being forced to include minority students, started displaying racially charged symbols like Confederate flags and banners stating "The South shall rise again," with one SAE member of Alabama stating that between 1945 and 1963, the University of Alabama had receded 100 years. Furthermore, even after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and affirmative action programs being put in place at Harvard, Princeton, and Yale, fraternities remained committed to excluding African Americans. In the book True Gentlemen by John Hechinger, he states, as higher education began to drop the diversity, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton dropped Jewish quotas and instituted affirmative action programs to enroll blacks and other minorities. Rather than adopt the spirit of the civil rights movement, they fought against it. Often they relied on a particularly effective way to preserve the white brotherhood, the requirement of a unanimous secret vote approving new members. Under the time-honored blackball system, brothers would pass around a box into which they would deposit balls that were typically the size of marbles. A white ball represented approval of a pledge and a black ball rejection. A single prejudiced member could blackball a Jewish or black pledge, no questions asked. In 1966, David Sheehan, a white student who was chairman at SAE's Harvard chapter, nominated as a member Tommy Davis, who was an African American. He was the first black man to ever receive nomination for membership in SAE in the entire history of that old traditional Southern fraternity. Sheehan, who became a civil rights lawyer, wrote in 2013, Davis was blackballed. I stood up and announced that I was going to blackball every single nominee until whoever had thrown up blackballs against Tommy Davis fessed up and gave us their reasons. Sheehan blackballed the next 10 nominees until one member from Cleveland said he heard Davis dated a white woman. While I would love to say that all racial barriers in the fraternity system have been taken down, with Tommy Davis being allowed access into SAE, this simply isn't true. In 2016, a 9-second video surfaced showing fraternity members at Sigma Alpha Epsilon from the University of Oklahoma and their dates on a charter bus heading toward a formal event. They were clapping and pumping their fists while chanting, "There will never be an N-word in SAE. You can hang him from a tree, but he can never sign with me." Within 24 hours of the video going viral, OU President David Boren severed ties with the fraternity and gave members until midnight to vacate their house and eventually expelled 2 student leaders seen in the video. The 2 expelled students, Parker Rice and Levi Pettit, issued public apologies. Parker Rice said that he was deeply sorry and called his actions wrong and reckless and claimed that the chant had been taught to them. Levi Pettit held a press conference at a black church in Oklahoma City, surrounded by black community members, where he stated that his words were disgusting and that there were no excuses for his behavior. The Sigma Alpha Epsilon headquarters immediately closed the Oklahoma chapter and suspended all members. The national president, Brad Cohen, said that he was disgusted and embarrassed by the video, emphasizing that the chant was not part of official fraternity tradition or education, which was not really true. However, in the wake of this massive scandal, the National Sigma Alpha Epsilon organization took several steps to address systemic racism. They hired their first ever director of diversity and inclusion, established a mandatory diversity education for all members and staff, established an anonymous tip line to report inappropriate behavior, and formed a national advisory committee on diversity and inclusion. The investigation by the university later concluded that while the chant was not official, it had been informally shared at national SAE events, which the national headquarters continued to investigate. All right, so now I'll be talking about hazing and why I think it still happens. And I just want to say that there is a ton of literature about hazing that exists, and there's a lot of stories about hazing that have been shared. And while I did read a lot. There's probably something I missed. So if you want to leave a comment about any particular story you found interesting that you wanted me to discuss, please feel free to go ahead. I also want to say that most fraternities haze, even if they say they don't. My mom was in a service sorority in college. They met only on campus in buildings at approved times, and they hazed. Not with alcohol or anything, but they still hazed. So if you're told at a pledge event that there is no hazing that will happen at all, that is very likely untrue. Fraternities haze to build loyalty, create unity, and test commitment, viewing it as a tradition to prove worthiness. Though research suggests that this often backfires, creating bonds among pledges rather than the whole group. In Fraternity by Alexandra Robbins, she follows a real yet misnamed college student named Jake who rushes Zeta Kappa, although he's promised a hazing-free pledge experience. During his pledge experience, all pledges are forced to drink until half of them pass out and then they go to a club. They are given chores to do every day. The more they mess up, the more chores they get. Expected to show up at 12:30, but they're not allowed to be in sight of the fraternity building until 12:29. Forced to run 2 miles each Saturday, with their time as a group collectively decreasing every week. Write an essay summarizing an adult video. Told to memorize a binder of information about the fraternity and is verbally harassed in front of others if everything isn't perfect. During Hell Week, stays over at the house and is not allowed proper sleep. Isn't allowed to look at a specific brother nicknamed Z, who further verbally abuses them. His GPA plummets. The national chapter does come in to investigate hazing, but because his brothers are aware of it, they tell all the pledges not to say anything, and if they do, they're kicked out, which results in the national chapter learning nothing about the hazing that actually occurs. What I found most interesting about this book was, after Jake is accepted into the fraternity and Winter Rush comes along, he decides to haze the new pledges, continuing this cycle of abuse, even though for a good majority of it, Jake hated the pledge experience. One important thing to keep in mind about hazing is that it is illegal in 44 states, including Washington, D.C. In New Jersey, where I live, hazing is defined as conduct connected with initiation or membership in a student or fraternal organization, excluding reasonable athletic or military training, that knowingly or recklessly endangers the mental or physical health of safety of another person. Now, despite hazing being illegal, there are many reasons why it still happens. The first is that alumni want it to continue. Many have the belief that it is their responsibility to make pledges better and that hazing teaches respect. They often view hazing as vital links to the organization's history, and that if the initiation process remains unchanged, the experience of membership stays as an unbroken line from their time to the present. What I learned while researching was that alumni were actually involved in hazing as it happens, not just as an oversight thing. In October 2011, 9 men, 3 current Francis Marion University students, and 6 alumni were arrested and charged for a hazing incident. The student pledging Phi Beta Sigma fraternity was paddled so badly his buttocks was bleeding, and he suffered kidney damage that sent him to a hospital for 2 days. One of the 6 alumni charged with hazing was a high school teacher. He was placed on administrative leave. Another suspect was a unit director with a local boys and girls group was also suspended. All 3 current students were suspended from school for a year and banned from the FMU campus. There are also many incidents of older members trying to change the fraternity process and alumni who donate to the frat saying no. The other thing is that fraternity and sorority Greek alumni are significantly more likely to donate to their alma mater than non-Greek alumni. This means that colleges have to cater to what Greek alums want because if the frats are disciplined too heavy, the money stops coming in. At Salisbury University, founder of the Sigma Alpha Epsilon chapter, Michael Scarsborough was initially a member of the university's foundation board and donated $830,000 for their fraternity/sorority center in 2001. However, after the SAE chapter at Salisbury was disciplined, he canceled a $2 million donation for their football stadium. He later argued in the SAE magazine that hazing was defined too loosely and that in some ways it was inevitable. So while hazing is illegal, colleges want the alumni happy and they want their donations to keep continuing. So they will often look the other way as long as the money still comes in, meaning that fraternities are essentially free from justice as long as the alumni continue to be generous. Alumni can also tamper with the justice system and have many resources to do so. In 2002, David Fiacco of the University of Maine suspended its SAE chapter for a year for underage drinking at a party. Citing high-risk student behavior and a history of similar violations, Fiacco ordered the chapter to undergo alcohol education, perform 750 hours of community service, and ban drinking in its chapter house. The chapter's prominent alumni decided to fight back. The alumni hired an attorney, Larry Willie Jr., a former Bangor mayor who retained a private investigator to look into Fiacco's background for evidence of bias against fraternities. The investigator later tracked down Fiacco's 1998 conviction for driving while intoxicated in Colorado, as well as a restraining order taken out by a former girlfriend. The group arranged for the information to be mailed from Colorado to the University of Maine Board of Trustees, the university president, the campus newspaper, and the Bangor Daily News, in quote saying, "Is this honestly the best qualified candidate for the University of Maine for their Office of Judicial Affairs?" Newspapers ultimately didn't print any of this, and the university president stood by Fiacco. However, this really illustrates how alumni will employ dirty tactics in an effort to escape justice. Psychologists also theorize that fraternity members are influenced by this psychological phenomena, groupthink and group polarization. Groupthink occurs when individuals unquestioningly internalize a group's norms, prioritizing consensus over critical evaluation and individual responsibility. Because there is such a pressure to conform, brothers running pledge processes won't speak up when things get reckless because they don't want to upset group harmony. This is really why people won't call 911 or call an authority figure when things are going bad, because they don't want to upset their other brothers and upset what the group wants. Additionally, group polarization is a social psychology phenomenon where discussions among like-minded people lead them to adopt a more extreme opinions or decisions than their initial viewpoint. It works in frats because people are exposed to new viewpoints, feel the pressure to conform, and then either perform the new viewpoint in a more extreme way in an effort to fit in. This means people will adopt a more sexist, racist, or aggressive manner in treating their pledges in an effort to impress the rest of the group and appear more masculine. The reason why hazing still happens is that men are kind of just lonely and don't really know they're being hazed. College is the first time boys are away from home, and this is really when they confirm or question their preconceived notions about masculinity. At the same time, while these young men are experiencing feelings of loneliness and anxiety as much as young women, they aren't being encouraged to share as men don't cry. There is so much pressure to belong and appear as masculine as possible. Because of this, 95% of hazed students don't report hazing. At the University of Kentucky, 37% of students said they didn't report it because they didn't want the group to get in trouble. 32% of members said they were scared members of the group might retaliate against them. And 25% said that advisors were present at hazing incidents. But the biggest statistic to me is that 9 out of 10 college students didn't know that they were hazed. But finally, without a death or a serious injury, hazing isn't really seen as worth caring about. Without a death or a serious injury, we don't really talk about it. All the stories that I've shared thus far have only really been about pledges getting seriously injured. All right, now I'll be talking about the relationship between fraternities and women and sexual assault. Now, disclaimer, there is so much literature written about this, and while I am proud of the research I have done, I know it didn't cover everything, so again, if there is a story that you thought I missed, please let me know and put it in the comments. So historically, there has always been a double standard among women in fraternities. Fraternity members celebrate their own sexual conquests, but shame women for getting around. This mirrors the 20th century fraternity behavior of engaging with women who have marriage material with respect, while having sex with working-class women who are prostitutes and lower class. In a 2005 research done from Ohio State, fraternity members were found to be 3 times as likely to commit sexual assault as non-Greek members. Additionally, in 2016, a Harvard University task force attacked what it called sexual entitlement of their final club members. These final clubs invite female students and view as accepting the invitation to the club as an implicit agreement for sex. Half the senior women who go to the final clubs report non-consensual sexual contact. However, starting in 2021, Drew Faust, the first woman to leave Harvard University, announced measures to make these final clubs accept women into them, hoping that diversity ends this history of sexual assault. Like fraternities and hazing, there are several reasons why sexual assault still happens. The first is sororities keep going back. Now, this sounds a little crazy, but let me explain. Let's say you're a low-ranking sorority in a specific college, and one of your sisters is assaulted by a brother from a fraternity. Your sorority doesn't want to cut off the fraternity because that fraternity is probably a big part of their social schedule. After all, low-tier fraternities and sororities often partner, so if you cut that fraternity out, there aren't many other fraternities you can hang out with, and thus your social calendar is kind of messed with. Alcohol is also another big factor. Henry Wechsler, creator of the term binge drinking, found that 86% of Greek men and 80% of Greek women report binge drinking, opposed to the 45 and 36% of non-Greeks. In a 1998 study, 47% of men who admitted to committing sexual assault also reported that they were binging alcohol at the time of the attack. Being in a frat consistently increases one's odds of being sexually assaulted or being the assaulter. Another thing that could, once again, impede the efforts to stop sexual assault is the fraternity members trying to impede the efforts of justice from being served. In the book True Gentleman, Hechinger says, in September 2012, a female student who was drinking at the University of Iowa SAE Chapter House reported a sexual assault, was hospitalized, and dropped out of school. Later that month, David Grady, the dean of students, said fraternity members had been discouraging potential witnesses from helping investigators and threatened to call the police or expel them if they continued. Along with the example of intimidating the judge, while I do believe that everyone has the right to a fair trial and there is nothing wrong with trying to ensure that, the efforts to bully their way through the legal system is simply despicable and does not paint a good picture of the fraternity system at all. The intriguing thing that I learned while researching is that fraternities have their own political action committee called Frat Pack. One of their more controversial moves was their support of the Safe Campus Act in 2015. The Safe Campus Act, H.R. 3403, was a bill introduced into the U.S. House of Representatives in 2015 with the intent to change how college handle allegations of sexual assault. It would require campuses to report alleged sexual assault to law enforcement and wait for police investigation before a school could begin its own disciplinary processes. Colleges could still impose some interim measures like no contact orders or housing changes, but couldn't discipline or punish students or student organizations for misconduct until formal investigation by the police was concluded. The bill also included due process protections for people accused of sexual assault, such as formal hearings, legal representation, which hasn't happened thus far, access to evidence, and cross-examination rights. This approach forced campus authorities to let law enforcement take the lead on investigations, rather than letting schools conduct their own internal Title IX or student conduct proceedings. While I will say that this bill does promote due process and a fair trial for those accused of sexual assault, it also would discourage reporting, as many survivors do not want police involvement, that only a small percent of sexual assaults are ever reported to law enforcement, as many survivors feel uncomfortable or re-traumatized by police involvement. This would also weaken campus responses to sexual assault by tying schools' hands and limiting their ability to act on known threats. This would also conflict with Title IX obligations, which require schools to address sexual assault promptly and equitably with or without police involvement. Many survivor advocacy groups, campus safety organizations, and Greek leaders opposed the bill. Some sororities withdrew support from the associated lobbying effort when it became clear that it would impede their ability to protect survivors. So Frat Pack, the aforementioned fraternity and sorority lobbyist group, supported the bill, stating it was meaningful and included much-needed reforms. They argue that it would improve due process for accused students, require greater transparency in how campuses handled sexual assault, and give law enforcement exclusive investigative lead to bring in perpetrators of sexual violence. They also pointed out that the bill restated the Title IX exemption for single-sex organizations, which at that moment had been an ongoing advocacy priority for the group. What I want you to take away from our discussion about Frat Pack is that they are a lobbyist group who donates to political campaigns. Frat Pack previously donated to Frederica Wilson's campaign in September 2012 ahead of her 2012 re-election bid, which is very funny because Wilson dubbed herself the Frat Buster and generally supports anti-hazing legislation. Frat Pack, which generally lobbied against such federal oversight, had pressured her office to back off the legislation. Wilson denied that Frat Pack blocked the bill, citing hiccups with the proposed penalties as a result for the delay, but ultimately the legislation was not filed, illustrating that even though a quote-unquote politician who is a frat buster wants to enact anti-hazing legislation, money is power, and Frat Pack has a lot of it. Okay, so I feel like I've been really negative towards fraternities for the past whatever so minutes of this video, so now I'm going to talk about the positive impacts that fraternities and brotherhood can have on young men. So fraternities exist to provide brotherhood and family for young men on campus, kind of getting them acclimated and providing them with a home. Some great stories I heard while researching was of Travis, a Virginia grad who was hesitant to tell people he was asexual, but came out to his brothers and was accepted. Because his brothers so readily accepted him, Travis was able to accept himself. He said, "My fraternity made me comfortable with all my random quirks and allowed me to fully embrace my personality. I no longer feel the need to act differently around certain people or hide facets of my personality because the fraternity has been so accepting. An Oregon chapter treasurer said, "The fraternity system is not just a place to drink beer and do stupid stuff with your brothers. It is a place to shape yourself to be a better man." Again, furthermore, I want to emphasize, the bonds between fraternity members is sacred. Bonds are ritualized. Loyalty is sworn. If you are in a frat, you have a family on campus. I am not in a fraternity, but it does seem like a really great environment where young men can learn how to act socially and gain a family. I want to emphasize, fraternities are not a monolith. There are good fraternities and bad fraternities. All right, that is everything I have for you. Please like and comment. I know today was a pretty controversial topic. Thank you so much for watching if you're still at this point, and I will see you next time.